At a high society charity gala, billionaire bachelor Alexander Monroe suddenly grabbed the wrist of a young biracial waitress because of a small tattoo on her arm. That fleeting moment unraveled a buried secret hidden for 20 years within one of America's most powerful families. It sparked a quiet war between a man who wanted to be a father and a dynasty that refused to let him. What would you choose? A daughter you never knew, or a billion-dollar legacy? Let us know in the comments. Every like, share, and thought helps us keep telling the stories that matter. Now, witness the journey of a man who gave up everything, just to be called Dad. New Orleans. A crisp fall night. Crystal chandeliers bathed the grand hall of the Monroe estate in soft golden light. It was the annual Southern Capital fundraiser, an elegant gathering of the South's wealthiest elite. Glasses clinked, jazz music floated through the air like perfume, and nothing seemed out of place. Alexander Kane, 54, stood quietly near the auction table, dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo. He was the sole heir to Kane Industries, a man of quiet power, deliberate movements, and a gaze that sometimes wandered back to somewhere it didn't want to go. He had never married. Rumor had it he once fell in love with a young black woman who worked summers at his family's resort. But she vanished, without a trace. Layla Monroe, 22, worked the gala part-time. Her mixed-race features caught the light as she moved gracefully between guests. In one hand, she balanced a silver tray. The other gently pushed up her sleeve, revealing a small tattoo, a broken dahlia. Alexander saw it. He froze. That tattoo. It was identical to Elise's, the woman he once loved and lost. Layla walked closer, unaware. When she leaned in to pour him wine, Alexander instinctively reached out, gently, firmly, grasping her wrist. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "That tattoo, do you know what it means?" Layla hesitated. "My mom gave it to me when I was 10, she replied. She said it meant freedom and goodbye. Alexander let go. His heart slammed against his ribs. She couldn't be. But she also couldn't not be. Layla dipped her head and walked away. Alexander stood frozen in the ballroom as jazz played on. But inside him, everything had stopped. That night, the Monroe estate lay silent. No more clinking glasses. No more hollow toasts beneath the chandeliers. Only the slow, deliberate ticking of the antique clock echoed through the study, thick with the scent of old leather and unopened wine. Alexander sat alone. A soft amber desk lamp cast a quiet glow on his face, weathered by time but still defined by the rigid lines of a man who had spent a lifetime living up to other people's expectations. In his hands, a silver-framed photograph. Elora. Her smile still lit up the frame like summer sunlight. Soft curls framed her gentle face, shoulders delicate, eyes full of warmth, a kind of warmth he'd never found again since. Summer 1994. She had worked at his family's resort. They fell in love, quietly, shyly, like two people from different worlds, daring to dream in the dark. Until the dream ended. His family didn't need to shout. One look, one cold stare. One quiet threat, and Elora knew she'd never belong. And he, who thought himself strong, let her walk away. Without a word. For nearly 30 years he never married, never loved again, never stopped searching for something, even if he couldn't name it. Until tonight. The tattoo on the girl's wrist, Layla, had shattered time. Elora had the same one. A broken dahlia, a symbol of a goodbye that was never truly wanted. Alexander placed the photo down, reached for the landline, His voice, when he spoke, sounded like it was pulled from somewhere deep and long buried. "James, I need you to look into a girl. Her name is Layla. Find out about her mother, where she grew up. Everything." He paused. "No contact, no pressure. I don't need a story. I need the truth." He hung up. Outside, the sky remained dark. He lifted his glass but didn't drink, just stared at the red reflection dancing in the wine, like a glimpse into years he could never get back. That night, he didn't sleep. But for the first time in decades, he didn't feel alone. Somewhere out there was a chance that he hadn't lost everything. Not yet. Not if he started now. The next morning, rain drizzled gently against the tall windows of the Monroe estate. Droplets traced slow, uneven paths down the glass, like the sky itself was swallowing something it couldn't say aloud. Alexander stood at his desk, staring blankly out the window. In his hands was a thick dossier, encased in soft brown leather, freshly delivered by James, his personal assistant of over 20 years. He opened it. The first page, Layla Bennett, born 2001, Austin, Texas. Mother, Elora Bennett. Father, not listed. Alexander turned the page. A death certificate. Elora Bennett, deceased 2017. Cause, ovarian cancer. No next of kin. Unclaimed. Cremated per hospital policy. His hands trembled. The paper shook violently in his grip, but he didn't let go. His lips pressed tightly. His eyes burned. Elora was gone. And he never knew. No message, no goodbye. No one had told him. The only woman he'd ever loved had vanished into silence, the same way she had once left his life. He kept flipping. A child's drawing appeared. Crayon lines, messy but alive. A small girl, about 10, had drawn it. The note beneath read, "Layla, from art class." The drawing showed two figures, a curly-haired woman holding a little girl. The lines were crude, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were Elora's. Alexander picked up the drawing. He placed his hand over his chest, feeling his heart pounding through the fabric. All these years, he'd thought of himself as a lonely man living with ghosts. But now, he knew. Layla wasn't just a name, not just a face that stirred something in him. She was blood. She was the echo of a love he had once let go. She was what Elora left behind, not out of guilt, but as a message. That he still had one thing left to do right in this life. He sat down, slowly, placed the drawing on the desk, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in decades, he cried. Not for Elora's death, but for the truth that hit harder. He had a daughter, and he let her grow up in this world without ever knowing who he was. Layla never liked winter afternoons. Not because of the cold, but because of the silence that came with them. The kind that carried old memories through breath, left questions lingering in the air, and let strangers stare too long without speaking. The cafe was usually full by this hour. But today, for reasons she couldn't name, the world felt slower. He had been there since morning, an older man, sitting near the window. No phone, no book, no order. Just waiting. Like someone 30 years late for an appointment. Only he remembered. Layla approached, tray steady in her hands. "What can I get you?" she asked, calm but cautious. "Americano, no sugar," he said. She wrote it down, was about to turn when his voice stopped her. "I think I once loved your mother." Layla froze. Something inside her snapped tight. The air outside was cold, but what swept down her spine wasn't wind. It was knowing. He said her name. Elora. a name Layla had only whispered to herself in dreams. He spoke of a love, real, then lost. A love he left behind because he wasn't brave enough. There was a pause, a long one. Then, like a thread snapping inside her chest, Layla said softly, without looking at him, "She cried once. Looking at this." She rolled up her sleeve just enough to show the edge of the tattoo. Said it reminded her of something she couldn't forgive. "I thought she meant someone else." Her fingers trembled. "Now I'm not so sure." She looked him in the eye. For the first time. "So let me ask you this. If I had come to you at 10 years old, standing in your doorway, would you have let me in?" Her voice didn't crack, but it cut deep. Alexander blinked, stunned. You don't have to answer," she said quickly, stepping back, "because the truth is I already know. She did too." He didn't argue. Didn't defend. He reached into his coat and placed a business card on the table. "If you ever want answers, I'll be here." Layla turned. Walked away. Didn't look back. That night, in her tiny apartment, she opened the box of keepsakes her mother left behind. At the bottom, folded between old photographs and faded receipts, was a letter, never sent. To Alexander Monroe, it read. Layla sat down on the floor, her fingers resting on the envelope. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know whether the thing in her chest was grief or rage. Because some doors, once opened, never close the same way again. Layla had never asked about her mother's past. Not because she didn't wonder, but because in Elora's eyes there was always a soft fog, a veil Layla knew not to push through. That veil protected something delicate, but now it had lifted. That night, after rereading the unsent letter addressed to Alexander Monroe, she gathered her courage and went to the only person who might know the truth. Aunt Ava, the woman who took her in after Elora passed, when Layla was just 16. Ava's house sat at the end of a quiet alley. The kitchen smelled of dried herbs and burnt coffee. She sat at the old wooden table, her eyes just as warm as Layla remembered. Except this time, they held something else. Hesitation. Layla placed the letter down. Said nothing. Ava looked at it, then nodded slowly, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for years. "Yes," she began, "your mother once loved a white man. Wealthy, elegant, and completely outside her world." Layla stayed silent. "They met in the summer of '94. She was a waitress at a resort. They kept it quiet, but his family found out, and they didn't scream. They whispered. That was enough. Elora left that very night. Took nothing, said nothing. When she learned she was pregnant, she told no one but Ava. All she said was, he had a heart, just not enough courage to use it." Ava opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo. Elora, visibly pregnant, still wearing her dahlia necklace. Her eyes looked straight into the camera, but she wasn't really there. "You know," Ava said, placing her hand gently on Layla's, "sometimes grown-ups bury pain not to hide it, but so their children don't have to carry it." Layla lowered her head, and for the first time she understood. Elora hadn't stayed silent out of fear. She stayed silent out of love. And that silence was now breaking, piece by piece. Layla knew she couldn't move forward unless she stepped into the past, even if it hurt. The public library that afternoon was quiet, almost reverent. Warm light poured through the tall windows, painting soft shadows across the old wooden tables. He sat at the far end, alone, waiting, as if he'd been waiting for decades. Layla walked toward him. Her steps were steady, her heart less so. She had spent nights wondering if she would come. Now she was here. No greeting, no small talk, just the question she'd rehearsed 100 times in her mind. "If you had known, would you have claimed me?" Alexander looked up. The question hit him like a wave he'd been bracing for, but not ready to face. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But if I had known, I would have never let your mother walk away alone." Neither of them cried. But both felt something cave inward. Layla reached into her wallet and pulled out a photograph. It was Elora's tattoo, the broken dahlia from a time before it had faded. Alexander took a breath, then handed her a photo of his own. Elora, smiling, wrist turned just enough to show the very same flower. They looked at each other, not as strangers, but as two pieces of a story finally fitting together. No more questions, no explanations needed. Some truths, when finally spoken, don't require words. They just require presence. And in that quiet library, beneath the hush of old books and older pain, a woman carrying new wounds and a man haunted by old ones saw themselves clearly for the very first time. The Monroe family boardroom sat on the top floor, where sunlight didn't reach unless filtered through stained glass, colored by power, legacy, and control. Oil portraits lined the walls, every one of them a white man in a suit, frozen in the same cold-eyed stare. A dynasty of men who believed their name mattered more than their humanity. Alexander stood alone. No lawyers, no advisors, no agenda except truth. Across from him sat Jonathan Monroe, 82 years old, brittle in body but sharp as razors in mind. Around the long oak table were uncles, cousins, half-brothers, men who built nothing but lived richly off the name they'd inherited. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice like a storm, barely restrained. "What exactly are you doing, Alexander? Parading your little mistake in public? Claiming a girl you never raised, never named?" "She's not a mistake," Alexander replied calmly. "She's my daughter, Elora's daughter." Laughter cut through the air. His uncle David, a man who once lost his inheritance over an affair, sneered, "Is that all it takes now?" "A story and a tattoo?" Alexander didn't flinch. "No, it takes truth. The kind this family's been allergic to for generations." A cousin scoffed. "You really think dragging her into this family will fix anything? She's not one of us." "Neither was my mother," Alexander said, eyes locked on Jonathan. "You never let her sit at this table, even after she married into it. You made her eat alone, said she was too common for Monroe traditions." The room stiffened. Jonathan slammed his palm on the table. "You bring that girl in, you forfeit everything. I'll strip your shares. Cut you out of the trust. Everything you built, gone." Alexander stepped forward, calm, deadly. "Everything I built was without your permission, without your approval. And I'll keep building, with or without this name. But I won't let you erase my daughter, like you erased every piece of decency this family ever had." David snorted, rising to clap mockingly. "So noble, so righteous. Remind me again what Elora was. A summer fling. Or a maid you couldn't resist?" Alexander's voice cut like a blade. "Say her name again with that tone, and I'll make sure the world knows what you did in Savannah in '91. Dead silence. Jonathan stood, his face crimson. "This is treason." "No," Alexander replied. "This is freedom." He turned his back, walked to the door. The room stayed frozen, frozen in power they could no longer wield over him. And in that moment, Alexander Monroe didn't just defy a dynasty. He dismantled it with nothing more than truth and the will to love without condition. No stage lights, no logo wall, no polished PR introduction, just one microphone. One room inside the Monroe Foundation, a room usually reserved for handing out scholarships, not speaking truth. Reporters shuffled in, unsure what to expect. Rumors swirled. mergers, resignations, maybe a political run. But when Alexander Monroe stepped in, everything went silent. No tie, no smile, just tired eyes, a steady voice, and nothing left to hide. "Almost 30 years ago," he began, "I loved a woman named Elora Bennett. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous. But she had something no one in my family ever had. Courage. Click. Flash. The sound of keys tapping accelerated. I let her go, not because I stopped loving her, but because I was too weak to protect what was right. She raised our daughter alone. Quietly, in poverty, in pain. And I wasn't there." His voice wavered. "I didn't deserve a second chance, but I got one." A journalist raised a hand. "Are you certain she's your biological daughter?" Alexander looked him dead in the eye. "I don't need a test. I see Elora in her eyes. I see myself in her silence. That's all the confirmation I need." Whispers turned into murmurs, some skeptical, some stunned. He took a deep breath. "Elora Bennett was pushed out of my life because of the color of her skin. But I will not let our daughter be silenced because of that. Not again. Not ever." Somewhere in the city, Layla watched from her phone. No tears of pain. Just tears of something else. For the first time in her life, someone stood in front of the world and said her name. Not hidden. Not ashamed. Not afraid. Dusk fell like a gray blanket over the small cemetery on the city's edge. The wind brushed the tall grass, soft and reverent, like nature itself was bowing in silence. Layla and Alexander walked slowly, side by side. No words. No guide. Just the quiet understanding that this moment had been waiting for them. The grave was simple, placed at the very end of the row. The headstone read, "Elora Bennett, 1972-2017. A quiet life. An unnamed love." Alexander stood still. The man who once faced boardrooms, battlefields of finance and cutthroat deals, now trembled in front of a stone. He knelt. His hand reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, worn box of ebony wood. He opened it. Inside, a faded necklace, a real dahlia, pressed between two thin glass circles, now brittle but whole. Alongside it, a blurry photo. Elora, young and pregnant, staring into the camera with calm defiance. He passed the box to Layla, but kept his eyes on the stone. She accepted it, fingers clenched, knuckles white. Then, gently, she placed the necklace on the grave, like sealing a chapter, not out of denial, but as an act of closure. "She once told me," Layla whispered, "you had a heart, but not the courage." She paused, her voice cracking. "Now I know that's not true anymore." Alexander didn't answer. He didn't need to. His tears spoke for him, quiet, raw, and without shame. He placed his hand on the cold granite. "Elora, I'm sorry. And thank you for letting me find her." A sudden gust of wind lifted a single dahlia petal from nowhere. It floated gently down, landed on the headstone, then carried off again. No choir sang. No priest blessed the air. No audience bore witness. Just a father who had failed, and a daughter who had been forgotten, finally standing together. And in that stillness, something new was born. Not perfection, not resolution, but forgiveness. 1 year later, the city had shifted seasons again. Leaves fell like gold across sidewalks, but this time, Layla wasn't walking them alone. That evening, she stood just inside the entrance of her first solo art exhibition. No champagne, no PR banners, just her work, quiet, aching, defiant. The gallery walls bore wounds, not decoration. Portraits of women hiding grief behind lipstick, children sitting between courtrooms and custody. Hands reaching for others that weren't there anymore. At the center of the room, under a skylight's soft glow, stood the final piece, a life-size painting of Elora. Her curls blew gently in a painted breeze. Her lips barely parted, like caught mid-breath. But it was her eyes that stopped people in their tracks. Not sad, not angry, but reaching across the canvas, saying, "I made it this far, so will you." On her wrist, the broken dahlia tattoo. But in this version, the petal had been sewn back in, stitched not with ink, but with gold, in the style of kintsugi, the Japanese art of honoring broken things by healing them with light. Guests stood in silence. Some held their breath. One whispered, "Who is she?" Layla stepped beside the painting. She wore a black dress, simple, but her voice was clear. "That's my mother, and this," she touched the tattoo on the canvas, "was once a wound, but now it's a map. A way back to who I was supposed to be." Someone raised a phone, streaming live. Layla looked directly into the lens. To anyone out there who thinks being loved late is the same as being unloved, it's not. Some people arrive exactly when you've stopped expecting them, and that changes everything. In the back of the room, unnoticed, stood Alexander. No suit, no tie, just a quiet man among strangers, eyes fixed on a portrait of the woman he'd loved, and the daughter he was still learning how to stand beside. After the crowd thinned, Layla walked toward him. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just placed a folded card in his palm. He opened it. Her handwriting read, "Not father, not friend, but a man who stayed when it counted, and that's enough." He folded it slowly, looked at her. Then, without words, he did something he hadn't done since his own childhood, reached out and held her pinky finger, like a vow only two people could understand. They walked out together, no cameras followed. No applause, just two souls, no longer strangers, choosing presence over perfection. Because sometimes, showing up is how resurrection begins.